Okay, I think we're ready to go. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jenny Wüstenberg, and we are here for one of the Memory Studies Association's digital events. So we are here to launch, or rather relaunch, the MSA Mentorship Program and to have a general conversation with some great experts on mentorship about, what mentorship should be, can be, and sometimes is. And yeah, I'm glad to see so many of you here. That's a great sign. So what we're going to do today is we're briefly going to introduce ourselves and our speakers, and I will briefly introduce the mentorship program, the MSA Mentorship Program, and then we're going to go right into our conversation with our panelists. So as I said, my name is Jenny Wüstenberg. I'm a professor of history and memory studies at Nottingham Trent University. And as many of you know, I was until recently MSA co-president, now I'm past president. And I have a little bit of experience with mentorship myself, both as a mentee with some great experiences and some not so great experiences, from which I probably learned just as much as from the great ones. And also I have the experience of helping to build the MSA Mentorship Program, as well as a small mentorship program at my university. So I'll hand over to my co-host, Catherine, so she can introduce herself.
All right, thanks, Jenny. And it's lovely to see so many people here and some familiar names and lots of new names as well. So hopefully we can recruit lots of people to what we hope will be a very beneficial scheme. So I'm Catherine Gilbert. I'm a research fellow at Newcastle University, and I work in the School of Modern Languages and broadly speaking in the field of memory studies. And I've been a member of the MSA Executive Committee since July 2021, and we're actually bringing the Memory Studies Conference to Newcastle University next July, so I do hope a lot of people here will be joining us for that. And similar to Jenny, I've had some interesting experiences with mentorship, some not so successful relationships, but also I've had the privilege of having some really excellent mentors, and I think that's really helped me to grow as a scholar, but also thinking about how I want to develop as a leader and in turn be able to mentor early career scholars. I wonder if I was going to introduce our three panelists, but I wonder if I'll just very quickly say who they are, and then once we actually get onto the panel discussion, I'll ask them all to actually briefly introduce themselves and their experiences with mentorship when we actually come to that. So if they don't mind, I'll just say very quickly, we have Ethel Tungohan, who is an associate professor and a Canada research chair in the Department of Politics at York University in Toronto. And her work looks at migrant social movements and immigration and social policy. And she is also the host of this wonderful podcast, Academic Aunties, that we strongly encourage you all to go and listen to. And she's going to tell us more about that very shortly. We also have my colleague at Newcastle University, Hannah Scott, who is a New Act Fellow in the School of Modern Languages. We have the privilege of sharing an office. And she's researching the role of popular music in responding to experiences of disease, medicine, and public health, and especially at the Parisian Café concert. But she's speaking to us today in her capacity as one of the founders of the UK-wide University College of Modern Languages Early Career Support Network, which was set up in 2020. And again, she'll tell us more about that shortly. And finally, we have Wulf Kansteiner, who is our president-elect of the Memory Studies Association, and he is a professor in the history department at Aarhus University. So he's a cultural historian, historical theorist, and memory studies scholar, focusing on cultural memories in film, television, and digital culture, as well as the narrative structures of historical writing, the methods and theories of memory studies, and the history and memory of the Holocaust and other genocides. So we're very much looking forward to the panel discussion, but we will first give Jenny a few minutes just to sort of introduce the MSA Mentorship Program that we're hoping to relaunch, well, that we are relaunching this autumn, and to give a bit more of a rationale behind how within the Memory Studies Association we want to think about mentorship more broadly as a way of bringing us together as a community. So over to you, Jenny.
Thank you. Yeah, so well, the Memory Studies Association is a pretty new association. As some of you may know, we officially launched ourselves in 2016 and became an official, legal organization in 2017. And the idea of having a mentorship program along with the formal organization is, came pretty early on. So we realized, I think, when we were, building the Memory Studies Association, that, because it wasn't very institutionalized yet, this field of memory studies, that a lot of younger scholars, and by young, I don't mean age, but, new to memory studies scholars were struggling because often they were in, a main discipline like history or literary studies or whatever it was, and they didn't necessarily have someone they could talk to about how to build a career in memory studies, or how to be strategic about their publication choices or their conference choices and all of these kinds of things. So we had discussions early on, and I have to give a quick shout out to Hannah Teichler, who's a former executive committee member who was really instrumental in this as well. Early on, we were just talking about, how could we set up a program where we can match people who wouldn't otherwise necessarily meet, or where, junior scholars might be nervous about approaching more senior scholars, to ask for their advice. And so we came up with a program for that, and it ran for about 2 years, more or less. Wulf was also involved in that at that point, and Jonathan Bach. Yeah, we had a pretty successful sort of first phase where we matched a bunch of people with scholars, and some of those relationships, I think, were very beneficial, for both parties. Now, as you all know, then COVID happened, and in this case, it really kind of slowed us down. I think we were all overwhelmed, as many of you probably can relate to, and it kind of went dormant for a while. But actually, I think for me, it also really brought home the point that we'd been thinking about this as a pretty sort of strategic, if you have questions about, well, where should I apply, or what should I work on, or how should I make sure I still, I'm still marketable in history as well as in memory studies, or whatever it was somebody was considering. So it was a pretty sort of, career-oriented idea at first. And I would say that my thinking at least changed with the pandemic, where lots of people I knew, but also me personally, were really struggling with all the demands of caring responsibilities, with just dealing with this global catastrophe, and and with just kind of feeling like we need to maybe also think about how we support each other as human beings, and not just taking care of our careers. And I think we had a great conversation during the Warsaw conference in 2021, which was completely online, where we had a roundtable of women thinking about memory studies. And yeah, that really brought home to me that I think I would like to think about mentorship in a much broader sense. So maybe also strategic, but not only strategic, and thinking about how we can build a memory studies association into a really caring community, an inclusive community. And I'd just like to point you in the direction of Roa Masai Charambira's essay that is on our website on transformative inclusivity, where she really says, the Memory Studies Association is pretty new. And so we have a real opportunity here to build a different kind of structure, and not to replicate all of the awful things that make academia so hard sometimes and so cutthroat, right? So I think we could kind of think about this in a different way. And I think this also goes, and I'll share my screen and show you the website of the Memory Studies Association, the page on the mentorship program, where you can see how you can sign up for it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So let me share my screen. So the reason I'm sharing my screen is that in order to participate in the mentorship program, you need to be a member of the Memory Studies Association. So that is our one stipulation here. So not everybody will be able to see this if you're not yet a member. And membership is not too expensive, especially for junior scholars. And I'd just like to point out that anyone who feels like they really want to become involved, but they can't afford the membership fee, that you can always contact us, and we have ways to include you in any case. So if you look at this, here's the mentorship program. You will see that there are deadlines, 2 deadlines a year where you could apply if you would like to become a mentee or a mentor. And what we do is once you fill out this form, this describes, how does the mentorship program work? What are the expectations of the mentee and the mentor? What is the role of the MSA? We are basically here a mediator and a matchmaker. But if you see here, when I scroll down, there's the form that you would fill out. And in the form, you have the opportunity to name people that you would like possibly to have as a mentor. But what we want to highlight is that we will have a confidential database of mentors, and we will look at the topics and research areas that you identify as important to you to try to match you with someone. So it's less about, having a famous person, famous scholar as a mentor, and more about trying to figure out, who could really advise you on the kinds of things that you're struggling with. So mentorship is obviously really individual. So, when I was doing the mentorship program I participated in as a postdoc, I was really struggling with work-life balance, with having a pretty young family and trying to build a career. So I wanted someone who could advise me on that. And it was less on, where should I publish, for example. So that's the kind of thing we want you to identify so that we can match you with someone. And it doesn't necessarily mean that, someone really senior could best advise you. Sometimes the best advice is given by someone who, might formally be more junior than you. So mentorship is really, individual in that way. So if someone you identify here on this form, you could see, as a good mentor, happens to be in our mentorship database, then obviously we will try to match you with that person, but otherwise we will try to find someone who we think might work well. And we would at this point, of course, give a big shout out to anyone who thinks they could act as a mentor. Again, it's not just for senior scholars, right? I think, for example, if you've just been on the job market and you have some really up-to-date insights on that, that would be a really great thing to share with somebody. So please fill out our mentor form if you could see yourself doing that. And the last thing I'll mention is that on this page, there's also a mentorship agreement. So basically what happens once you fill out the form, we match you with someone and you agree to meet with someone, we would really strongly advise the two of you to talk about and sign a mentorship agreement. It's really mostly a tool to get you to talk about expectations, because it's a little awkward sometimes to say, well, what do you actually want me to do? Or, how many meetings do you think we should have? Well, this kind of puts it on the table. And it really helps you to be clear, because obviously everybody's busy, right? And it's important to be upfront about that. So That's right there. And the other thing that I will mention before I hand back over to Catherine is that the MSA, of course, also has lots of other resources that we have put together or that we plan annually to help in career development and all this kind of thing. So every annual meeting, we offer MSA Forward, which is our PhD training workshop, as well as a methodology workshop and a series of master classes. And we will now also endeavor to have a mentorship kind of networking meeting at every annual conference. So there are a lot of things you could already take advantage of as a member of the MSA or as an attendee of the conference. You know, we can meet other people who have the same issues maybe and just, you know, engage in some peer mentoring. But we hope that the mentorship program will also really, you know, come together through these mentorship workshops at our conferences. And the first one will, of course, be in Newcastle, as Catherine has mentioned. Catherine, did I forget anything?
I think that was pretty comprehensive.
Okay.
So I think we'll jump straight in then to our discussion with our panelists and hopefully pick up on some of the points that Jenny's already mentioned about what mentorship can be for our academic communities and how we can better care for each other. But I would like to start by asking our three panelists to introduce to briefly describe how they came to this topic and how, you know, what are their experiences with mentorship, why they've developed or become involved in the initiatives that they're working with. So perhaps we could start with Ethel, if you'd like to say a few words about your journey and particularly about the Academic Aunties podcast.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this space. And I'm really excited to hear about the initiatives afoot. I was, you know, taking notes as Jenny was talking, and it's absolutely important now that you have a new association to create new norms and new ways of doing and being. In terms of, you know, my journey into mentorship and why I ended up starting Academic Aunties, which is a podcast where we have conversations with people about the hidden curriculum that is part of the Academy. I mean, I think I want to make clear that the Academy was conventionally never made for people like me and for people who are women, who are people of color, who are part of equity-seeking communities, right? And so understanding that is important, because a lot of the times when we think about different norms about how, for example, asking your funding agency, hey, you know, would I be able to use part of my grant to bring my child over for field work, and you get pushback. You're like, well, how can I do the work when I can't bring my child, right? Like me being a parent and being a scholar, you can't kind of just separate that, right? So a lot of these norms exist because the Academy was never built for us, right? And so I think one of the things that I want to emphasize is I'm only here because of my mentors as well. And mentors could include, for example, my PhD supervisor, Professor Joe Cairns, without whom I wouldn't have survived the PhD program. But they could also include people whose advocacy for me I don't know about. Right? There are people who open doors, who advocate for you, but you just don't know they're doing that. So we all know, or at least I'm telling you for those of you who don't know, that we need to puncture the myth of meritocracy, right? So interventions such as sitting in a PhD admissions committee, right? Or sitting in a scholarship committee, or sitting in, heaven forbid, a job search committee. There are people there who do act as your advocates, and you may not know that as well. And I've sat in these spaces and I know how important presence is as well. And so I have a lot more things to say about mentorship, but in this brief intro, what I wanted to say was I started Academic Aunties at the height of the pandemic. It was March 2020, and I was extremely distraught because of toxic workplace norms. And I felt that it was important for me to reach out to people who I talk to normally, my friends, my network, where we could just kind of talk about the academy and talk about, you know, why is it that these norms happen, and we're kind of trying to catch up to understand why these norms happen, right? So the very first episode was literally filmed with me and two of my best friends. Miriam had her baby there, Nisha was there as well. Our mic was really off, and our topic was, why are there so many assholes in the academy, right? Sorry, am I allowed to curse? I think I felt like I just cursed there. Okay. And so it was cathartic, because then we understood that it wasn't just individual assholes, right? That the academy itself trains us to be the smartest person in the room and not form community and not, you know, elevate each other's work, right? And so from there, it kind of snowballed and it's become quite popular, which is surprising and also really heartwarming. So we also have episodes on what really happens when job search committees deliberate, what really happens for people who were applying in the job market. And here we talked about distance traveled, and we talked about how not everyone in the academy is at the same starting point, right? So things like reimbursement culture, where we wait for graduate students to get reimbursed for attending conferences, that creates a huge income gap as well. So the long and short of it is, you know, when it comes to mentorship, I feel like I've benefited a lot from my own mentors, both people who I know and people who I'm sure behind the scenes advocated for me. And the podcast, Academic Aunties, which you can find at academicaunties.com, it's just a way for me to puncture the myth of merit in academic spaces, and for me to show women of color, members of equity-seeking group, first-generation scholars, that we are the academy, and it's up to us to also change the norms and also be subversives, right? To ask different questions and expect more.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ethel. There's certainly a lot of questions we can pick up on there. Hannah, if I pass over to you now, it'd be great if you could say a few words as well about your journey, and particularly your work with the UCML Early Career Support Network. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I think Ethel has set out the need for mentoring well enough that I can't possibly put it in such excellent terms, but I have benefited from having such an amazing PhD supervisor who, through 8-9 years of precarious employment after my PhD, would continue to be super supportive. And talking to my fellow precarious early career colleagues, this was unusual, and I was very much lucked out with Professor Susan Harrow, who was a gem. And coming across more mentors as I sort of progressed through various jobs, many of them were not unwilling to understand the situation for all those groups that Ethel has talked about: young, first generation, women, parents, equity-seeking groups, but just couldn't, because you know, they were towards the end of their career. They hadn't had the opportunity to engage with very many people that were outside of that kind of norm of what the academy expects. And actually they were turning out, although they were willing mentors, they weren't good mentors. And felt that what was needed was a system where good mentors, willing mentors, could be paired up really appropriately with people who they had specific skills to help, specific knowledge, and as was mentioned earlier by Jenny, often that isn't necessarily very senior people. But modern languages, a bit like memory studies, the scholars are so scattered about in different areas of work, in different language groups, that this just didn't really cohere into any one place. You know, within a department, you rarely have two people working in a similar field of interest. So I got approval from the University College of Modern Languages to set up a very similar database to what Jenny was talking about, really, that the MSA is going to establish, where people volunteer to mentor. We list a whole load of their experiences, their sort of key things that they want to mentor on. Maybe they're like great on public engagement, or that they really want to help first gen scholars or whatever, and started matching people up. And a key bit of that was that we felt that it's also really hard for more established scholars. Like, it's an insanely busy job, even when you have tenure. Like the pressures on your time are so intense that we wanted to make it possible that that could literally be, you just have a question. You don't necessarily need a whole year of mentoring. So we set up two parallel schemes. One is a year-long scheme which matches up mentors for kind of general career support and personal support, and one which is a one-off scheme. So you can apply at any time during the year and go, I just have this one thing I want some help with. It's like, we need 2 hours of sessions and that's it. So the responsibility is less on both mentor and mentee. And as a result, we got, I think we now have 121 volunteers, of whom only 40 are prepared to do the year-long scheme, but many are prepared to help in a more ad hoc basis, which has worked really well for us. And it has been really, really encouraging actually to see how many more established colleagues have been just so glad to actually find there is a venue that they are able to give back through, which their own departments did not necessarily provide for them, which has been remarkably uplifting. We thought it was going to be an uphill battle, and I'm very happy to say it hasn't been the whole way. So yeah, there's lots of parallels with what the MSA is trying to do, and I'm very glad to talk about any of the details as we get into the Q&A.
That's great. Thank you so much, Hannah. And Wulf, we'll come to you now then and ask you to say a few words, not just in your role as president-elect, but also your work with mnemonics and mentoring younger scholars. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the privileges maybe of having been around a little longer is that I have many years of experience being a memory scholar in a field as a historian where the idea of memory studies is not necessarily always welcomed or embraced. And it's also an advantage to have worked in different settings, in different career settings. And I think one of the struggles, or one maybe also opportunities that cuts across these different areas is, on the one hand, of course, academia, also academia, our interest can be a very interesting journey. It can be a work that is self-determined, where we can do many of the things we passionately want to do. And on the other hand, academia is a high-risk work environment. It can be dangerous for your health in very specific ways. And this kind of combination, a combination of flexibility, but also a very stress-inducing environment, requires, I think, a positioning, requires as early as possible to start trying to find a way, trying to find a set of priorities, trying to find a way of concrete tools to handle the flexibility and sometimes unreasonable, very unreasonable expectations, and unreasonable expectations because of the long-term ingrained structure of academia, frankly, structures that are, for example, very sexist among other things. So therefore, mentoring, I think, is important, and it's very important in a field like memory studies, because these risks are exacerbated by interdisciplinarity, where it's then the challenge is even more pronounced to find one's niche, to find the place where one feels comfortable, and that has to do sometimes with strategic thinking. But I think, as Jenny already emphasized, I think one of the most important things for any academic career, but maybe especially for people in this kind of interdisciplinary work where we are, is to find our rhythm, to find a balance. How do we find a kind of a rhythm that works for us in this field, that works for us personally? And again, also what has been said, I want to absolutely emphasize, I think very often the best advice comes from people who have just had the experience that you need help with. It doesn't come from people who have been in graduate school 30 years ago. That I would certainly emphasize. Now, intellectual feedback, there's a little difference. There's an accumulation, I think, of a certain way of having trained more graduate students makes you maybe a little bit better as a sounding board to work and give feedback. for a doctoral project. But often, and it's also, I think, a very good idea to have a combination of input. Get a range. Make your decisions, because not all input is created equal. People will disagree and give you different advice, and that's also can be, I think, a very positive experience.
Yeah, thank you very much. I actually wanted to put a question following on from what you've just been saying, Wulf, about what is a mentorship relationship, and how, because we're involved in so many relationships through professionally, as we go through our PhDs, our masters, our early career stages. But what is a mentorship relationship, and how does it differ from, say, that of a PhD student and an academic advisor? Perhaps, Wulf, we could start with you this time. If you just want to carry on with what you pick up on what you were saying.
I think in my experience, it's a mentorship relationship, perhaps even more than a formal relationship of advising, is trying to find the mutual interests, trying to find the exchange, trying to find what works for both sides, because a good mentor is a person who is curious and interested, and who also receives in this relationship. Then the person is more willing to share time, more willing to engage. And I think, therefore, one of the points of departure is just a sense of honesty, from both sides. What do I want, and what do I want, even as a mentor? What do I want to get out of this? And maybe this is also something we can more explicitly perhaps ask potential mentors in our form to see, because that's what works. As everybody has said earlier, we are extremely busy, and we want to do then the things where we also feel we can make a difference, and we can make a difference when it clicks, when we feel that we are receiving also as mentors. I think that's very important.
Yeah, if there's time, I'd love to come back to that question of what is the benefit also of being a mentor, not just being a mentee. But I'd like to put that same question to Ethel, if I may, about what you think is a mentorship relationship.
First, I think it's important to understand that you don't have to have one mentor. I think Jenny had mentioned that as well. And I also want to puncture the perception that mentors are senior scholars. It could also be people who are at your level. It could be people who are younger than you. And I think for me, mentorship is about community, right? And I think that I have different pockets of people, different communities of people who I ask about different things. So if I wanted to ask about, for example, publishing or research or writing, there are other people, not necessarily in my discipline, not necessarily in my rank, who I would resort to as well, right? I also have group chats. I don't know if people are on WhatsApp or Facebook, a committee of friends who, let's face it, the academy has so many norms that's so hard to understand, right? So if, for example, something happens where, just to cite an example, I was at a conference panel a few years ago, and the chair kind of, introduced all of the panel members. The male panelist was talked about and was discussed in like glowing terms. He was called doctor. The female panelist, the chair was like, and so this is what the chair said: I'm so pleased to have a bevy of beauties like next to me. And so I was sitting there in the audience and I was like, what? So I just kind of texted my friends and I was like, is that's inappropriate, right? And everyone was like, yes. And so I think you need to have friends, you need to have a community who can kind of guide you and make you understand that it's not you, it's the academy, right? Which is something that we say all the time in Academic Aunties. One thing I will say, though, is that it's also important to understand that just because there are people who you consider mentors doesn't mean you have to follow their advice all the time, right? Take the advice that you get and kind of cherry pick to see what works for you and what doesn't work for you. And it would be irresponsible for me not to highlight that there are toxic mentorship relationships, and I keep hearing about this, right? Mentors who kind of want to mold you in their image and who get resentful if they feel that you're deviating from their path. So, just kind of do a gut check. See, is this advice working for me? Is this advice not working for me? And understand that you can get advice from different sources, and a mentorship relationship, in answer to the question, is different depending on the actors involved. There's no one way to characterize it, right? And I would also say that, when it comes to my mentors, of course, I have my PhD supervisor, my formal faculty mentor when I started here at York, but I also consider younger scholars my mentor as well. I think it's important to understand that some of the norms that I guess now I'm a mid-career scholar that we've learned are actually pretty toxic, right? And so some of my early career scholar friends, some of my graduate students, some of my postdoc friends, they emphasize the importance of rest. I don't know if people subscribe to the nap ministry, and sometimes I just have conversations with colleagues who are early career, and I'm like, okay, well, I want to do this, and this during my sabbatical. And they would say, why? What do you have to prove? You've got tenure. Calm down. Why don't you sleep? Stop it. And I'm like, yeah, you're right, actually. And so I think it's important to kind of see mentors where they are. There's diverse ways to characterize mentorship relationships. And I will say that without these communities that I'm part of, I wouldn't be lasting in this world.
Thank you. I think that's such an important point as well. There are so many things that, the way these norms are created about, for example, I saw a colleague post on Twitter just the other day that, oh, look, this is great. I used my annual leave to finish this article that I've been wanting to write for a long time. And I was like, well, it's great for you for finishing that article, but at the same time, it makes all of us who take annual leave and just rest, feel guilty when we feel like we should be using our annual leave to write a new paper or something. So I think that's a really important point about rest. But that's not necessarily what we need to discuss here today, but thank you for raising that. And Hannah, can I come to you and ask you the same question about what you think a mentorship relationship is?
I completely concur with Ethel that I think community is a really good way of seeing it. I would say one of the main differences perhaps to a PhD advisory relationship is that has a clear power relationship built into it. Whereas the ideal of mentorship, obviously there's always going to be relations of senior and junior or whatever. But if you're seeking information from someone, there's always still a power relationship, but that we can try and be honest and maybe more humble about that in a context of mentoring in a way that you subscribe to a certain degree of power relationship for when you're doing your PhD with your advisor, but mentoring tries perhaps to step back from that a little bit, be a bit more circumspect about those power dynamics. And reading that transformative inclusivity article it just rung so many bells, because I think the idea of trying to prioritize caring for each other is a really positive thing for mentoring, but also in that we need to consider the mentor as well as the mentee. That one of the things we've often heard back in the feedback from our mentors is that actually what the mentees needed was mental health support, essentially, and it's sort of not high grade medical mental health support, but just that it's so crushing the first 8-10 years of the career and the lack of employment and all the rest of it, that what they really needed was someone to kind of help them with their morale and tell them everything's going to be fine, even though it's clearly not. And that the mental health burden was being directed at people who have no training to deal with that. If there's practical stuff that people are seeking, they were very, very able to support with practical advice. But in the end, you can't make academia and the job market better on your own. And they were not equipped with any training to support the low mental state of many of the mentees. given that 1 in 3 early career scholars has mental health problems, you know, there's going to be a serious thing to take into consideration. I have to say we haven't resolved that issue through our own mentoring scheme yet, but I think taking that into account, that it goes both ways, much more in mentoring than it does in a PhD advisory relationship, is also a really important starting point. Given that at some point all of us will be mentors as well as mentees, it's worth kind of considering how that cuts both directions.
Yeah, thanks. That's yeah. But again, really important points raised. I'm sure some of these will come up again in the Q&A. I think as well, a lot of people here are interested in sort of the practicalities of establishing a mentoring relationship. And I wanted to ask all 3 of our panelists as well about how would you advise people when you're going about setting up a mentoring relationship? How do you go about setting expectations, setting boundaries, managing those challenges within the relationship? And perhaps, you know, either from your own experience or even from a facilitatory point of view. And Hannah, I'll come straight to you this time, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So when we started our scheme, particularly because we set it up in June 2020, so we wanted to try and keep it as free. We felt that keeping it as free as possible would make more people be involved, that we didn't want to put too rigid expectations or frameworks. You know, people have expertise in this already, they've got experience in mentoring. We just sort of said, these are some very vague parameters, but we don't want to impinge upon your expertise, and really you probably know better than we do. I would say that worked well from the point of view of the mentors, who mostly have done mentoring before, have a sense of, you know, the need to set up a structure, regular meetings, expectations, like Jenny was saying about the agreement, setting that up in advance. What we hadn't considered is that mentees don't always have any experience of being mentored and that they did not have a sense of their responsibility or their how to get anything out of it. And actually, as a result, over time, we have set up more advice, which echoes a lot of what you've got on your website, actually, about a sort of mentoring agreement of who's in charge of what a sort of a vague framework of how many meetings. We say once a month for an hour, but obviously people can adapt that according to their schedules. Setting up in advance of, so at one meeting they set up for the next meeting what they want to discuss, practical aspects like that, which are inherently flexible, but actually that we had been too flexible to start with. And a lot of mentors replied in the feedback at the end of the first year that actually there was a sense of, many people called it entitlement. I'm not sure that's necessarily where it was coming from, but that people were getting these mentors and going, oh great, now mentor me, so, and weren't sending over documents in time to be read by very, very busy mentors during a pandemic, and would sort of say, oh, we'll meet at this time, and would just not show, no doubt for good reasons of their own, but it put the mentor in a very difficult position, and just kind of took the steam out of the relationship. So I think it is important to have those parameters set up in advance and then flex them as necessary for the individual pairing, the individual relationship, and the pressures that are upon them. And to set that out in advance is, I think, very useful. And we didn't do that, and I would say I would recommend it. We do it now.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. It's certainly very useful advice for all of us thinking about entering into these types of relationships, or perhaps re-evaluating mentoring relationships that we're already in. Yeah. Ethel, could I put the same question to you as well, please?
I think for me, as someone who now gets asked a lot of questions about the academy and making sure that you have boundaries, I think for me, because I do get a lot of emails now from people, it's about having, if you're seeking a mentorship relationship and you want to kind of coldly email someone whose work you admire, but you're not sure how to approach them. For me, what is helpful is if you have a specific ask, right? So for example, I've had people emailing me being like, I want to get into the Canadian job market. Can you point me to resources and explain to me how that works? And I can provide more structured and more targeted advice. And And so I think having a specific question would help. And I do think having a specific structure, which, I hear is what's in the works, would help as well. I do know that, I was once a mentee and I signed up for this scheme as part of this college that I was affiliated with at the University of Toronto. And my mentor, who's, supposed to be like, someone not in industry, but, someone higher up, asked me for my CV. And then just kind of their only email to me was like, well, why don't you get back to me when you've put in more, right? And so I think, what MSA is doing, kind of setting out expectations, making clear to both parties that this is what this relationship is going to look like, will ensure that these encounters don't happen, right? And it's also about kind of being clear, if you're a mentor, about what advice you can provide. And then a lot of people actually just want networks. They want to be part of a community, right? So for example, if people ask me something about publishing, right? And they're asking, well, how do I get a contract with the university press? And then they share with me their article or their idea, then I'll go, wait, you know what? You know who you can talk to? My editor. My editor at McGill University Press or whatever. They're really open about mentorship, and I've had conversations with them about bringing in early career scholars. Then I can direct the ask, right? So being clear on what you want your mentor to do and kind of setting in these parameters, I think, is what enables successful mentorship relationships.
Brilliant, thank you. And finally, Wulf, could I put the same question to you about expectations?
I think specificity. I think that's the key, as people have already emphasized, to be specific about what one wants to accomplish. I think on both sides, and I think when seeking a person and trying to establish a mentorship relationship, seeking a mentor, I think the mentors, they, in some sense, they want to be recognized, and I don't mean this negative. The specificity, for example, if it's research related, then the specificity can be that one does try to link to work that this person has done. It's much easier for them than to answer. If it's career related, if the specificity is established by asking a question that person can likely answer because of the experience that person has had. I think that's so in that sense, it makes this transaction so much easier when the person is clear when the mentor is clear what is asked of him or her. I think that's very important. I think another point, and this is almost like a point of advice also for the mentors, don't take things too personally. Not everything is, also mentors have sometimes fragile egos. Many academics have fragile egos. So I think very important is that things happen, people are always busy, and not to take it too personally. Even if people then withdraw, or if they perhaps drop out, then there might be reasons that has nothing to do with the persons involved. And I think that's also important. And here I would want to emphasize, I think recognizing that even in this relationship, there is often, especially if we are talking about people on different ranks and different phases of their career, there is a power differential. And when there's a power differential, I feel it's very important to keep in mind that the person who without tenure has more burden, more stress in principle, and therefore for mentors, it's a good idea to be relaxed and not be too insisting. Well, they didn't answer, or they didn't do this or this. It's perfectly fair to voice expectations, but it's also very nice to not be always concerned about oneself.
Yeah, again, I think that those are really useful points to bear in mind. I think Jenny has one more question for our panelists before we open it up to the Q&A. So I'll pass over to Jenny.
Yeah, thank you. This question I actually kind of thought of while listening to one of Ethel's latest podcasts, which, by the way, I just want to highlight that Ethel's doing this during her sabbatical. So thank you for using some of your protective time for this. And there's actually a great podcast about sabbaticals on there if you're interested. But the one that made me think more was, there's a podcast episode in Academic Aunties that's about precarious employment. And I think, certainly when I was doing the mentorship program I mentioned earlier, I was in a postdoc position that was ending soon, and I didn't know if I was ever going to be, in a permanent position. And there's so much fear wrapped up in that, right? You don't actually know if you're ever going to make it until you make it. And then so I think that a lot of people who probably or who may seek out and sign up for our mentorship program are in that position, right? That you're actually not sure whether you will be able to become, a full-time memory scholar, or whether you're going to have to branch out and do something else, or, open up a cupcake store, which was my backup plan for many years. So I wondered, I think this a point that was raised in this episode that I listened to, that a lot of the problems we face are systemic, right? So there's a lot of emphasis, I think, in some mentorship programs on sort of the things that you should do personally, right? Just write another book, write another article, right? Go to that conference, do this. It's all very individualized. So I wanted to ask our panelists, like, how do you deal, or how do you advise people to deal with the systemic problems of this thing that we're facing, and the reality that many of us may not find tenure track positions where we have sabbaticals and so on. I don't know who wants to start, maybe Ethel, since I mentioned your podcast.
The episode itself was really, it was one of my favorite episodes to tape, because it featured a friend, a scholar, Dr. Vanina Steinbach, who, she was able, so she basically was terminated by her department chair on her 5th year. And the University of Toronto had an agreement where if you've been working in the university for 5 years, you then become permanent. But the chair decided at the very, very, very last minute to terminate her contract. She got a settlement, but that was also taxed, right? And so there were different things that could have been done to make sure that that didn't happen. First, her chair could have told her earlier, so she could have then started looking for jobs when there were still jobs to apply for, right? There are different interventions that could have been made. I think, Jenny, the question of precarity is something that I think we all need to acknowledge. That's kind of the elephant in the room, right? I think one of the things that we said in this episode is, and this is one of the things we try to see in Academic Aunties, is academia is a job. We are workers, right? One of the things that we linked to in that episode is Scholars Strike Canada, which is actually seeking more like better labor conditions for academics as well. Now, to your question, what do you do when people who are trying to get a footing in the job market are asking you for advice? I think one of the things we need to emphasize is we have to be truthful about the realities of the market, right? Another thing I have to say is that I see this constantly. I have my own friends going through this right now where, they keep asking me and other people, what is wrong with my file? I keep spending my money going to conferences. I'm paying out of pocket for this. I keep going to the different networks and association dinners and trying to meet people, and I keep publishing. And honestly, I have to be in debt because of this, right? And I think, just kind of reminding people, again, structurally, it's not you. You're doing everything that you're supposed to do. Mathematically, there just, at least in some contexts, there just aren't enough jobs, right? So making clear that that's the reality, I think, is important. Another thing is kind of to try to fight for better working conditions, right? Like, not that I kind of want to wave this flag, but being part of your university union, if you're unionized, would be one of the ways to ensure greater job security, but also mobilizing and asking, why is it that, at least here in the province of Ontario, the province keeps reducing funding for universities, right? And trying to kind of lobby, since we do have elections coming up, asking, your MLAs to kind of take on that cause. But beyond that, my final point is, because academia is just a job, what I'm trying to tell my own students and my own friends is to make clear that there's a robust community of alt-ac scholars who were so happy that they've left this world, that you shouldn't think that, first, you can still do research and not be an academic, right? And secondly, there's a world out there that you need to tap into. We have skills in writing our dissertation. We can manage a project, right? So it's about kind of having plan A, plan B, and C, and helping the people you're trying to mentor understand that there are skills that they can offer to the world, and trying to broker contacts in that way. I have a lot to say about this, but I'll just end there.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll hand straight over to Hannah, since I think we're running out of time. We want to get to Q&A soon, but yeah, it'd be great to hear what you think.
I mean, largely I agree with Ethel. Anyone in the UK context, we're looking at going into our 4th year of strikes this year. So, well, maybe at some point that will pay off. And yeah, pointing out that it's systemic. There's nothing that early career, particularly precarious early career scholars, can do about it. And everyone applying to our scheme is precarious and early career. And it is just is exactly the same things. People are saying, what's wrong with my CV? What's missing? Now, there are a certain amount of concrete things that if they're not there, it's a problem. But beyond that, in the end, there's not an awful lot that early career scholars can do. And just being frank and honest about that is worthy. We have started individually contacting more senior, sort of mid-late career people who have left the academe to be on our mentoring database, who have succeeded in academia and chosen, for a variety of lifestyle and sort of other career reasons, to leave the academe, and taken those skills and marketized them for all kinds of things. Charity work is a high one, education, advocacy, politics in a couple of cases, and having them. We've only got about 12 people so far, but I'm hoping that will be an area that grows, so that early career folk can say, but what can I do? All I know about is 19th century music. How am I meant to make that into a job outside of this world where someone thinks that's useful? And actually, those more experienced folks who've made that transition are able to go, look, what you've got is these skills, and these are the kind of people that you can talk to for if you want to go into publishing, or if you think you might like to be an educator in a school, or so on. And I think that's worth integrating into any mentoring scheme. Both people who've left and people who just can help you to appreciate those skills in a non-academic context, who perhaps came into academia from other industries as well. And that when you're asking people what their skill set is to join as mentors, or if you are joining as a mentor, to highlight those areas is actually really helpful for the people matching up mentors and mentees.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great point. I think maybe this can be a shout out to our MSA members who are not employed at universities, because we do have lots of practitioners, right? Memory practitioners in museums, or artists and so on. So please do also feel like you could become a mentor. That would be lovely. Wulf, over to you.
Yeah, very quickly, that last point you made is a point I wanted to emphasize. That's the big advantage of being in memory. There's a whole area out there of public history where there is employment. It's growing. Academia very likely will be shrinking again in the coming years, and that's a field that's growing. I do want to emphasize that necessity, or the healthy choice of having a plan B. Working conditions in academia are very different, and there are working conditions that are really bad, and where leaving academic employment is a very, very good idea, and one find better employment other places. So in that sense, I think it is important, as you have said already, it is a job, and it should be treated as such, and there are moments when it can be and should be discarded. There's a big difference, I would say, between, for instance, the US and Europe. In many places in Europe, having a doctorate can be a stepping stone to a completely different career. It's a little different in the US, where a PhD, with all the time involved, can quickly become a burden on the non-academic job market rather than an asset. But in other places, as I said, in Europe, it often is an asset, and that's a big difference, because it allows for exiting, sometimes under very, very good conditions. Yeah, again, it's the structure. The structure of academia is that the ideology is that we do it for the love of the topic, and therefore there is a high risk of self-exploitation. And that one has to try but then has to see it as a labor relationship, as a hardcore labor relationship, and it has to be also viewed from that kind of perspective. And I think also, and then strategically, I think it's very important to try to see, okay, what labor market do I want to get into? Where do I want to be employed ideally? And try to, for example, perhaps find a mentor relationship that works for that, where there are people who can give advice specifically for that kind of context. I think that, and then also one should never hesitate to change, so to speak, the identity, right? In some markets, it's much better to be a public historian. In others, it's much better to be a heritage specialist, right? These possibilities, those are possibilities that we have in memory studies, and I think one should take advantage of them.
Okay, thank you so much to all of our panelists. We would like to open the floor to questions now. So you will, I think Lorena is going to make it possible for people to unmute themselves and ask questions. But also, if you're happy to put your video on and ask a question, then that's great. If not, you're also very welcome to write questions in the chat. And if we don't have time to cover all the questions, we will try and make a note of all of them, and these are things we can address in future dMSA events, or perhaps at the mentoring workshop that we'll be running in Newcastle next July. So we've got one hand up already, and that's Holly. So if you'd like to go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to say thank you to everyone for the really wonderful talk. It's so affirming to hear people name the actual problems that people like me as PhD students are actively dealing with, and that institutions don't want to name because it benefits them to not name them. So it's just really validating to listen to everyone talk. So thank you for that. My question is specifically about the mentor-mentee relationship, and I'm thinking about what Ethel was saying earlier about equity-seeking communities. So I am disabled and chronically ill, and I don't see many people like me in academia, partly because it's such a punishing environment for disabled people, disabled women and parents especially. And I don't know how much it would benefit me to get advice from able-bodied people, for instance. So I'm just thinking about the question of representation in the mentor-mentee relationship, and if that's something that will be considered when matching people up with, to the extent that it can be, when matching people up on the system.
Is there anyone on the panel who would like to attempt to respond to that question? Ethel, please go ahead.
I think this is why in some spaces I've been in, kind of identifying, the specific equity-seeking community and forming mentorship circles on that basis is so key. So, one thing that was actually super life-affirming for me. Well, two things. First, the American Political Science Association had, a two-day session on women of color in political science, right? And what was great was they gave us money to all fly to San Francisco, and also they paid for our hotel, right? So, that ensured that people who had monetary problems could go. And the second one was the Women of Color Leadership Program, also at the National Women's Studies Association conference. I will say that, I think it is important to make sure that when you seek out a mentor, it's someone who understands your lived experiences. Experiential knowledge is so key, and I think we underemphasize that in the academy. And I think, thank you so much, Holly, for pointing out the fact that academia is so ableist, right? And, even kind of seeking pockets of support, pockets of community through Twitter. So #disability Twitter has been so affirming. Even, the discussions concerning ADHD and why is it that, a lot of mostly women academics are being diagnosed late in life, right? Because ADHD manifests differently for women. Seeking out these virtual communities of support are so important. So this is what I mean when I say we have to kind of diversify our understanding of mentorship relationships. You can seek out different communities depending on kind of your specific needs as well. And so, Holly, I mean, I'm sure you're tapped into these networks maybe, but there are these groups on Facebook that are quite active. And I find that even, and I'm active on some of these groups too, if you're facing a constraint. So, you know, one group I was part of, you know, the person was visually impaired. She was like, how, you know, when it comes to seeking accommodations, because I got invited for a job interview, how do I kind of seek the accommodations I want without, you know, the committee being resentful, and I, you know, like things like that. And the group actually, you know, responded empathetically, and gave suggestions for ways to move forward. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of tapping in to these communities of support as well.
I think, Hannah, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, and it's purely a practical stumbling block that we've come across in this sort of area, that was absolutely our ideal, is that we would have people would volunteer special characteristics that we could make a note of, that they'd be prepared to help mentor with. And I would say that women, parents, particularly women of colour, have been particularly prominent in saying, I want to help other young women, I want to help women of colour, I want to help young parents of any gender presentation. What we have had absolutely nobody volunteering for is on the disabled abled line. Now, I find it very hard to believe that nobody on our database is neurodivergent or has some kind of constraint in a physical or mental health capacity. But that information has not been volunteered, and it's very difficult to, you know, you can't force people to present themselves as identifying that this is what I want to identify as, that is what I want to actively work in. And that is, I think, where the communities that Ethel's talking about are particularly helpful, even though it is unfortunately perhaps less structured, but that is certainly a challenge that we have come across, and it's not one I know a good answer to, but if anyone here has suggestions for that, I think that would be an extremely you know, productive thing to develop further and to talk about.
Just maybe as a quick addition, I think what is important in this case, precisely because we might be lacking the information, and it would also be for the MSA perhaps difficult to find then in that sense the perfect match. That is a person that has experiences, as a mentor person that has experiences that are similar. But I don't think that's always required. I think what's required is the curiosity and a sense of listening. And then, you know, then you can see if what comes back is useful or not. I mean, that's also for a mentee then to decide. But, you know, there might also be the opportunity that, especially one of these cases where the mentor would be able to help, but also learn a lot. So I also think that's certainly one way where the communication that goes on behind the scenes, that it goes on in the MSA, it can be very useful, because we'll be part to try to match, right? So we'll be asking people, you know, how do you feel? How do you feel this? How you can work in this capacity, and and that might surprise all of us. What can perhaps happen.
Yeah, thank you. So we have a question from Lauren Cuthbert, again, sort of more generally about mentorship. And I'll just read this out if you don't mind. What do you do as a mentee if you end up with a mentor you don't feel is working for you? Do any of the panelists have advice on ending a bad mentor relationship? Not necessarily an overtly negative, hostile or damaging one, but also just relationships that you feel aren't exactly the right fit. I think this perhaps actually ties in quite nicely with what we were just saying. Yeah. So perhaps Wulf, I want, if you want to say a few words about this.
I think one really shouldn't. I think it's important to stay polite, unless something terrible happened. But other than that, I don't think one, also as a mentee, one doesn't have the obligation of going into detail and becoming all defensive. I think it should be understood that things might not work out for whatever reasons, and I think a polite note should suffice. That would be my advice here.
Jenny, I think you also...
Yeah, just to add to that quickly, I think it says on our website that obviously, you know, there's some things you can just discuss directly with your mentor or with a mentee, but if there's something where you really don't feel comfortable, I mean, that is our role then, right? I mean, we are there not to, you know, babysit your mentee-mentor relationship, but if there is something like that where you're like, oh, it's really not working out for me, but I really don't feel comfortable telling my mentor that, then that's, you know, something that we would help with, and just say, you know, find a way of you know, helping you and that, and maybe, you know, try something else. And I certainly had this situation with my mentor, and, you know, I think that's something that isn't unusual. So it's something that we need to build in into how we run the program.
Yeah. Did Hannah or Ethel want to add anything, or should I pass to the next question? Hannah.
Just to kind of reinforce what Jenny said, we do with the UCML scheme, we do a 6 monthly check-in for the annual schemes. So there is that opportunity that if people feel it in either direction, feel it's not really working, but we need some kind of intervention, but neither of us wants to be the first one. We as the coordinator of the scheme check in with mentors and mentees at the halfway point in the year. So actually that gives the opportunity for people to go, actually, you know what, could you possibly just tell them it's not working, and then we can get involved without anyone having to kind of be the person who puts their hand up and says, you know, for whatever reason the dynamics aren't fit.
Yeah, that might be something that we want to try implementing as well. Yeah, thank you, Hannah. We have a question. What would you say to a person from a non-Western space who is trying to seek mentorship? How does one navigate the structural and institutional gaps between a mentor and mentee? So often it feels like certain contexts are less understood, and therefore there are less chances of connection. Which of our panelists would like to address that one? Hannah, yeah.
I would say that is unfortunately the case, that there are, I would agree that there are fewer contexts where the connection, because of the nature of the academy, where it automatically works. But I think therefore it's something that we have to, as runners of mentoring schemes and as mentors, have to actively work to improve that. And it's not something that's going to be right straight away, because the academy has not facilitated non-Western views, including outside of the West. Many of the structures are still based on a kind of colonial framework. But the MSA is in a great position to do this, being such a new organization. I think we therefore have to kind of actively take that upon ourselves to try and make changes. And that includes actively seeking mentors for our mentoring databases that are outside of that context, or who have experience outside of that context. In our modern languages setting, that has involved particularly inviting individual scholars from, we've started with East Asia as it happens, because we have a number of Chinese and Korean departments in the UK, so it's been easy to make those connections. And it has they have been feeding back to us really helpful information about how that crossing of the Western line has just, like, this just doesn't work for us. That's just not how we operate. And I think it's a learning process, and that we have to be honest about our failings in that respect, and kind of make space for different ways of thinking and doing. But I'm afraid it's not there yet. And that's something that we should definitely invest in.
Yeah, Ethel.
I think this is why it's important to try to seek mentors outside your field and outside your discipline, but who might kind of share the same kind of experiential knowledge, lived experiences, right? And I also think, you know, it's incumbent on organizations to facilitate the participation of non-Western scholars from the Global South in professional association meetings, right? So, for example, do you have kind of like different registration fees for scholars coming from the Global South, right? Do you have allowances for scholars who are from the Global South, but if they go to Newcastle, will have to apply for a visa. Are there options for them to attend if their visa gets rejected, right? So there are ways through which power brokers can enhance participation and ensure that, we widen the breadth of scholarship and the breadth of experiences available in the conference, right? I think it's a really important point. I mean, it is still such a colonial structure, and I really hope we're at a point where we can talk about, frankly, about some of the impediments that Global South scholars have when accessing conference spaces, at the very least, in the Global North.
Yeah, I think that's a hugely important point and something we're trying to consider as much as possible for the Newcastle conference. But Wulf, just before you jump in, I just wanted to say about the MSA mentorship scheme. We will, of course, try and get as wide a range as possible of mentors in our database, but it is also voluntary. So we are reliant on people volunteering for this scheme. And it may be, as Ethel said, you can't get everything from one mentor relationship. So you may also need to go outside of the MSA and look for a mentor in a different context as well. But Wulf, what would you like to add here?
Very quickly, I just want to emphasize, I think compared to other organizations and the MSA, I see a significant consciousness and about the problem and curiosity also of reaching out. One of the things, for example, we have tried to do is things I've been involved in, also the travel grants for many MSA conferences, precisely for that reason. And then there are points of connection often also, right? I mean, for instance, the patterns of exploitation, they cut across. They're different levels, but they cut across, and they are sometimes surprisingly similar around the globe.
Thank you. Yes, we also have a question about requirements for mentees. So from a graduate student who is doing defense so defending the thesis in Korean studies. But realizing they're developing an interest in memory and heritage studies, but not acquiring enough knowledge of memory studies through studying Korean studies. I would say there's no requirement for you to be in a particular field to join the mentorship program. And perhaps these are precisely the questions that are important to discuss with your mentor. How if you are in, say, a modern languages department, how can you acquire the necessary expertise in memory studies if you want to develop your work in that direction? So I mean, in that respect, there's already a clear focus for building a mentoring relationship in that case. So certainly we're not putting requirements in place in terms of disciplinary backgrounds. But I wonder if, Wulf, I think you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, maybe very quickly. That could be precisely one of the specificities, right, of seeking a relationship. In fact, perhaps the person has a paper, something where it feels here is memory studies potential, and then would like to seek a mentor who perhaps has experience with those concepts that make sense. Why not? I mean, that could be a very nice, very specific mentorship relationship.
Are there any other comments on that point? But no, I would strongly encourage you to apply for the mentorship scheme in this case. We also have a question then, so about the degree to which the panelists think that first generation researchers are disadvantaged, or is this more to do with the large increase in PhD candidates generally? Ethel.
100%. There are disadvantages that first generation scholars face. I think as the Academy diversifies, the infrastructure to ensure academic success isn't really quite there, right? As I began my comments, I said that the Academy was never made for people like us. Us could encompass first generation scholars as well. This is a theme that we talk about a lot in Academic Aunties. It could be things like, no one wants to talk about money in academia. You talk about money and people look at you as though you're violating norms. But the fact is that not all of us have the same starting points, right? And so, when it comes to and I think this has to do with the idea that the Academy is a calling. And I'm saying it's not a calling, it's work, right? And so first generation scholars face multiple disadvantages, even starting at graduate school. If you don't know the norms, if you don't know how to speak, if you don't know how to act in certain spaces, that could out you as an interloper. Another thing could be funding packages, right? When I started my PhD at the University of Toronto in 2006, compared to where I am now, 2022, the funding packages for PhD students have increased this much, right? And you still have to live in an expensive city like Toronto, right? Another thing that I would like to point out is that some people can afford to not work. Like, you think that in graduate school, all of you are at the same income level. That's not true, right? I had people in my PhD cohort who could opt not to take on research assistantships and TAs because their parents were self-funding their fieldwork in China, right? I've also had conversations, this is, I think, one of our episodes in Academic Aunties, where one of our guests talked about her struggles in getting, well, it was an episode on the job market, and she was talking about the need to kind of finish her dissertation while she was on the market. And one of her mentors said, well, can you just not work? Just don't work, right? And for her, she was like, well, I need to work to pay for rent, but to kind of have to say that was really awkward as well. So I think I'll kind of end my remarks with this. I think, first of all, we need to publicize and vocalize and make visible these experiences to show that, you know, we're not all at the same level playing field, right? That there are distances traveled that we need to account for. And secondly, I think we shouldn't be afraid to talk about money, right? We should talk about the fact that, you know, even negotiations for salaries, right? That there's gender discrepancies there where women end up getting a lower salary. And we need to kind of highlight how, you know, all of these different experiences we have when it comes to negotiations, when it comes to kind of the norms behind that, right? We need to make transparent the need to have systems of support to make sure, for example, that why don't we publicize salaries, right? Why, right? Why are negotiations, at least in the Canadian context, done individually? Why can't there be a set salary given to all people of the same rank? So yeah, absolutely, first generation scholars face disadvantages, but I think structurally there are ways for us to push back too.
Yeah, Wulf?
Very quickly, I think one of the ways that first generation scholars are disadvantaged is the tacit knowledge of which rules not to take seriously. I think that's a very important part of many labor conditions, but very important in academia. If you look at all the expectations that are spelled out in academia for junior scholars, you cannot live up to them. It's structurally impossible. So you have to make a choice. You have to prioritize, and therefore you have to know which rules you have to take seriously and which not. That can be also subject to a mentor relationship. For example, it can be subject to, if you're an American system and tenure is what you're aspiring to, that precisely could be a very good idea to have advice about the tenure track process from a person, from a mentor at a completely, maybe different institution, maybe a similar type of institution. Again, I want to emphasize that point of money. And there are different cultures, also different labor conditions. In Scandinavia, for example, where I now live, graduate students are colleagues, and they are defined as colleagues because they're paid like colleagues. They're paid very well compared to graduates, to PhD students in other countries. And that's a big difference, and that difference has to be aware of that difference. And you know, that could be also something for the MSA to do, to talk money. Maybe that's a good way for us to break that taboo.
Yeah, Hannah, did you want to add anything? Or?
Yeah, I completely agree that first gen scholars have got an uphill battle largely because of money, and I suspect many people in this Zoom room are in that situation themselves, where it's a new field in their personal network. But I think this touches on many things. That many of the problems of setting up a mentoring network is that it's that paradoxical tension between asking the people who have the least advantage to do the work, do the burden of work, do the emotional labor, we are always, we talked about it so many times today, that if you're a woman, you might want a woman as a mentor, giving women more work. If you're, you know, from a heritage background, you might want someone from your heritage who is already disadvantaged and already has to do more work themselves. And that's also the case for first gen and for all of the various disadvantages that people find for different reasons in the academy. And I struggle to work the way around that, because ultimately the people that can help you most are the people that understand the disadvantages you face, and they themselves have got more work to do as a result of their own experiences and their own background. So I suppose it's just a thing to always bear in mind on a case-by-case basis as a mentor, as a mentoring network, and as a mentee, is how much to ask from the people who have got the experience from a personal point of view, that they have the disadvantage from a personal point of view to be able to help, and to know where to say no, and know when to ask someone who actually has advantage, because you don't absolutely need someone who understands every aspect of your situation to be able to give you a leg up or give you the advice you need. Although it's always tempting to be like, they're most like me, actually sometimes throw the labor at someone who perhaps has a bit less disadvantage too.
Jenny, I think you wanted to add something.
Yeah, just maybe also because we're coming to the end here. I wanted to say, I think that, you know, one of the things we could maybe or should do as the Memory Studies Association and in all of the, you know, forums that we have, is to normalize talking about these things, right? Talk about money, you know, make sure we say, like, it's important to make sure first that, you know, you have a decent income, and that's something we talk about all the time, or, you know, whenever that we feel comfortable doing that. Similar to, you know, talking about disability, talking about other challenges. Like I have myself started talking more about sleeping problems, and you wouldn't imagine how many people have said, oh my goodness, I struggle with sleep all the time, and, you know, it's something that we never talk about. So I think, you know, becoming a community where it's okay to say those things is really important, and maybe helps also with, you know, being able to talk to each other about these things, even when we don't personally feel that particular challenge that someone has. And just Giovanna had a question here that's very practical, so I just want to answer that, which is that the mentorship program is not on a rolling basis. So of course you can submit your application anytime, but just to make the workload manageable for us as well, we have 2 dates where we will, you know, commit to reviewing them and you know, doing the work of matching you with a mentor, and that's on our website. So it's coming up at the end of October and the end of March. So you can apply anytime, but that's, you know, when you can expect an answer from us. And with that, I will hand over to Catherine to close us up.
Yeah, just to add on that, I mean, I think a lot of people here are interested in becoming mentors, but we also really want, mentees, but we also really, really want to encourage people to sign up and become mentors, because without both sides of the equation, we cannot form these relationships. So we will also be putting out a call more generally to our MSA members to get as wide a range of mentors as possible for our pool. But please do, you know, take your time, think about what sort of topics you'd like to address, what advice specifically you're looking for, and do take the time to fill out the forms and apply for the scheme, and we will make as many matches as possible and hopefully set off some fruitful relationships. So thank you very much everyone for attending, and I think we're bang on our 1.5 hour mark. So thank you everyone, and thank you to our wonderful panelists. I would love to give you all a final word, but I think we might have to close the session. Jenny, what do you think?
Yeah, we're probably out of time. So in the interest of respecting people's time, I think we should probably stick to that. But yeah, I also want to just say thank you. It's been so interesting and informative. So I hope we see you all in person at some point soon, so we can you know, toast to all the things we've been talking about.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.